All righty. Thanks, David, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As ever, I've produced a lot of material, probably too much, but I'd rather err on the side of substance. So I'll try to get right through this, and I'll move pretty briskly. Today's topic is value streams, but not just any value streams at the portfolio level. So that's what we're here to talk about today. My name is Chris. I'm a consultant for SoftEd, and I love all things enterprise agility, although I also love coming up with alternative vocabularies for talking about agility. And you'll see that come through a little bit today. So this is just a quick agenda. Here's what we'll talk about. We're going to talk, obviously, about value streams. We're going to lay a bit of foundation for understanding the concept of value streams and how it can be used as a tool for managing value, tracking value, prioritizing things, and things like that. But the first half or so of the hour, we'll talk about just the fundamentals of value streams, where it came from, and understanding kind of what are the principles and concepts that we want to apply so that we can bring the concepts of value streams into a utility from a portfolio level. And then I'll cap off the end of the talk with a little bit, just a few concepts for further reading for you, some newer concepts, but concepts which are kind of ramping up pretty quickly because organizations are realizing that you need these to be able to actually enable the things that we talk about prior. So talk a little bit about metrics, a little bit about data aggregation, a little bit about something called FinOps, which is kind of on the rise. And hopefully that'll be enough material to get you started at least. But before we continue, I want to talk about this gentleman right here, a gentleman by the name of W. Edwards Deming, because if you're thinking about a technique like value streams, you have to take it back to this guy. Now, I'd love it if you post in the chat if anybody's, not familiar with Deming, moderately familiar, very familiar, just for my own curiosity. But feel free to shoot me a blurb in the chat. Let me know. And then we're going to put a halo over Deming because we like him so much. So why do we start with this fellow W. Edwards Deming? We start with him because he was the thought leader back in the day, and I'm talking like post-World War II, 40s, 50s. I mean, we're going on 90 years now, which in itself is a rabbit hole we could go down. And why are we still talking about this stuff 90 years later? Good question. But Deming really built his management advice on this thing he called the 14 points of management. I'm going to go one by one, but I would ask you just to skim them real quick. And you'll notice real quick a few things that should jump out at us as we're thinking about a contemporary enterprise portfolio and some of the challenges that we run into when we're trying to realize value across our tangled, complex, ever-changing portfolio. So just a few that I would highlight. Constancy of purpose. Constancy of purpose across a portfolio is difficult. You probably run into this. Continuous improvement. You hear about this a lot even today across all kinds of different frameworks. Continuous improvement, or this idea of Kaizen, is something that you run into in any kind of lean framework, any kind of agile framework. Leadership and getting rid of fear in your culture, safety culture and getting rid of fear is something we hear about really all the time. It's actually, we're hearing about more and more because we're realizing that, if you have an environment of fear, then that puts a thumb on the scale of the incentives of how people behave. And fear-based incentives are the opposite of the type of incentives we need in kind of today's type of environment where it's federated. We have to rely on people's agency. We're pushing problem solving and we're pushing solutioning. We're pushing strategic execution closer and closer to the edge of the frontline people who do the work. And that's a big topic these days. Well, Deming was talking about this a long time ago. Breaking down barriers between departments. That's another one that we hear talked about a lot. The idea of silos, things like that. So this was something Deming identified very quickly. Then making transformation everyone's job. That's another one. But, if you skim these 14 points, you'll see some things that probably resonate even this much later. But to cut to the chase here, Deming's management principles over the chapters of management evolution in the subsequent decades that eventually gave rise to a very tried and true set of 5 lean principles that you see here. And number one, of course, is identify value. Value is this idea of something that solves for a customer need. It's a product that's successful. And then, of course, at the end of the day, value really is money in the bank. Value is measured by money in the bank, at least in a commercial business, and even in most non-commercial organizations, there's usually a monetary component that you have to think about, whether you think about cost or whatever. So once you identify value, you have to map the value stream. That's what we're here to talk about. Once you have the value stream mapped, you can start to create flow. Flow is simply the idea that the more you can open up capacity, the more work flows through your system. Obviously, more value gets delivered. And then in order to do that, you establish a pull-based system rather than a push-based system. And you'll kind of see how that happens as we go through here. And then finally, this idea of continuous improvement, right? Now these 5 lean principles are all the rage across agile movements, agile frameworks of all stripes. And then you can just kind of see here from this graphic from the Scaled Agile framework, which I'll talk a little bit more with a little bit more nuance here in a few minutes. You can see this is carried out right throughout any agile technique, any agile practice, any agile framework. And so at least they say that they espouse those principles, right? But these look pretty much the same as your conventional lean principles. But this idea of organizational agility, enterprise agility, agility at different layers from team through portfolio, all built on these fundamental lean principles. So what are the principles intended to do? What do they look like in practice? And these are a handful of priorities in terms of what type of enablement lean principles are intended to give you, right? So we are intending to get rid of things that aren't adding value. And then on the flip side, we're trying to reduce waste. We want to get rid of waste in the system, but we want to, systematically block and tackle things that we already kind of know are future needs. That's not innovation related. It's not related to navigating some unknown needs, but we know we're going to need that stuff. We know we need infrastructure. We know we need support for projects that have been delivered. We know that we need platform maintenance, things like that. And all this is really all about optimizing the whole system end to end. And if we think about our organization, it's basically a system that's there to produce value somehow. But we have to have processes and specific management frameworks in place to do that. Otherwise, we end up with this unfortunate acronym of WOMBAT, which we're wasting things. We're wasting our money, we're wasting our time, and we're wasting the cognitive capacity of all the smart people who are working on our work, who are on our teams and things like that. So how do lean techniques do this? These are basically lean themes, lean outcomes that are intended to be applied at any level of the organization. So, either just from a very personal level, popping up to a team level, popping up to a project or a program level, and then finally, for our purposes today, popping up to a portfolio level, which is a big, huge mix of long, complicated, expensive projects and initiatives that can be hard to manage in a way that optimizes the best producers of value. So that's what portfolio management with value streams is all about, is understanding how do we visualize and map and chart process steps through the entire portfolio so that we know we're working on the right things and we're prioritizing the right projects. So this is not a comprehensive list, but some main points that I'll highlight here. How do we do this? How does lean do this across a portfolio? Does it by shrinking cycle time. There's a lot of benefits of shrinking cycle time. When we shrink cycle time, we reduce risk because shorter cycles are less expensive. Shorter cycles are faster. Shorter cycles allow us to get quicker feedback and adapt quicker. We can reveal lessons faster with a shorter cycle time. We can be more nimble and adaptive. The benefits of reduced cycle time, and go on and on. And then some of the ways that we can do that are to use a product forward approach. And this is basically the idea that we are orienting our workflows around product outcomes, not necessarily project outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean project managers go away. But it does mean that we can organize our work streams in a way that is built around product ownership, product management, understanding building products, and the customers or users for those products. And this third bullet here, always using an economic framework to make prioritization decisions. I don't know if anybody has ever seen initiatives be prioritized based on this acronym of HIPPO, or the highest paid person's opinion. This happens all the time, and this can be proven with research that's been done that at least half the time or so, it's basically just the big boss saying, this is the strategic priority, this is what we're going to work on. And of course, everybody strives to comply and they go off and work on that thing. But there really hasn't been any analysis done around whether or not that is truly the most important thing. So having a value stream management framework in place for your portfolio is really important, and you need some economic rubrics to do that. That can only be done if you have data visibility. So data is an important part of the portfolio management story, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. This idea of shifting left is related to reduced cycle time, in which basically we're trying to get the value decisions, the priorities, how we make those decisions, how we measure the ROI, the value. We're trying to get those things closer and closer and closer to delivered work, instead of having like a year-long budgeting cycle before what we did is evaluated. You've already spent a year's worth of person hours and millions of dollars at that point. So that's a bit late to understand whether or not you made the right choice. So shifting left is this idea that we want to get insight into that type of stuff earlier. Optimizing quality over activities, optimizing outcomes over outputs. If you look at something like the PMBOK or certain analysis frameworks, certain architecture frameworks, you'll see that they really incentivize the organization to focus on the outputs of a process, outputs of a project, things like that. But ultimately, those things are meaningless if we don't get the outcome. So if we stop measuring and we stop caring once the output comes out, then we're stopping short of really understanding value and ROI. And then a nod to a colleague of mine who may be in the audience today, the idea of process inventory is a newer idea that I'm getting my head around right now. And I thought it was worth mentioning here because a process, I think, it's interesting to think of process in terms of a set of connecting points where we can translate business needs and translate value streams across departments, across silos, and things like that. So these are just a few of the ways that we do this. Now, specifically, if we're using value streams as a tool for this, this is what the goals are with value stream management. We're looking to visualize our work in the enterprise, really complicated. A lot of it's invisible. We don't always have incentives charted. We don't understand whether we're developing the right thing. We don't always have well-defined KPIs for how we measure the value of the thing. All these things, right? I don't need to talk to you about these things. You guys encounter this stuff all the time. So making work visible and then being able to see and understand how does the work flow through our system and how is it managed to optimize value? That's what value stream management, identification, and mapping are there to do. And we can also understand how our time is spent. Now, time is money, literally. So we need to understand not just the financial metrics, but also the ROI on time and the investments of time and things like that. And then once we see that, we can start to identify waste. We can start to identify our bottlenecks, start to identify our constraints, expanding those bottlenecks, removing those constraints. That's how we optimize flow. That's how we get more capacity through the system. So that's the idea of value streams. And then finally, of course, there's a cultural component here. There's a lot of human factors involved. And so once we visualize and we have tangible understanding of how work is flowing through our system, it can kind of force the hard conversations and it can force some of the cultural changes that we need to do this, right? Now, you might realize right away that there's no practical reasons why none of this makes sense, but there are misalignments that prevent us from being effective here. There are cultural reasons. So one last nod to Deming here. Deming also introduced, along with his principles of management, he introduced these five diseases of management, as he calls it. Now, again, I won't go through these. Whoops, got ahead of myself. Won't go through these one by one, but I will just highlight the five. If you don't have constancy of purpose, you're not managing around the outcome in modern terms. That's a common disease of management. An emphasis on short-term profits, or moving around herky-jerky, not having the right incentives, not having enough time spent on a priority that we know is the priority that's going to produce value. I'm sure we've all encountered that. And then kind of evaluation by dumb metrics, or metrics that are focused on the worker. Now, as we encounter customers who are undergoing a portfolio level transformation, a lot of times we have a hard time translating value in dollar terms to value of work produced, work delivered. So a lot of times what you'll see in an immature portfolio transformation is that people who are in charge of the finances, the CFO's office, people who track funding and investment in the enterprise, they have nothing better to measure than things like capacity, hours logged, and things like that. So they have to measure something. And if they don't really know what to measure that's a little bit more aligned with value metrics, you'll see that they start measuring things like cost. They measure things like hours spent on a project, or team capacity, resources, things like that. And that makes sense from kind of an intuitive level. But if you analyze it a little more, you kind of realize, well, when people know that that's what they're being measured for, then they start to alter their behavior so that they maximize those metrics. It's just human nature. So they can maximize the amount of hours spent on a project because they know they're being measured on that. But does just clocking a lot of hours on a project, does that necessarily translate to business-based value? Of course it doesn't. But if you don't have a better framework in place, then that's what people default to, especially financial people. And that's not a slam. Their job is to measure cost benefit, ROI, measure what the funding is being spent on, and things like that. And if they don't have any better ways to do that, that's what they measure. So performance, merit rating, annual reviews that are based on these types of simple metrics, all they do is distort and corrupt your incentives. And also it's demoralizing, because usually, as we find, we probably encounter this, it's hard to satisfy metrics like that in a satisfactory way. You check the box on hours spent on something, but you're still losing money, then something's got to give there. Mobility of management is not just management, but this is a common problem we see. Constancy of leaders to give leadership the time to really develop the institutional awareness, the situational awareness. No too commonly, our C's move from here to there. The incentives are all screwed up, to be honest, a lot of times. So it's the same thing with team level talent. In today's world, things are so complex, things are so specialized, complexity and the volatility that we work in. It means that you got to keep teams together for a little while. They need some time to understand, oh yes, here's how we solve problems together. Here's the team dynamic that works for us, that allows us to produce something useful. But if there's not a good culture, or if there's a fear in the workplace, then a lot of the people who do the most valuable work, well, they're valuable elsewhere too. So they might just move on, take another job. And then running a company on visible figures only, it's kind of related to this point number 3 here, right? Visible figures only. Now, it's important to distinguish between running a company on figures. Now, figures and data are core to what we're talking about. But again, when we talk about value streams are about making something visible. It's about figuring out a way so that we can see and understand and map a meaningful course through a system that otherwise is comprised of a lot of invisible stuff. Technology work, software, products, IT services, these things that we work on all the time, those things are hard to see unless you deliberately come up with ways to see them, right? So based on Deming, based on Lean, value stream mapping was a technique that has been quite successful in other industries, primarily manufacturing. And this is just a quick snapshot of kind of a classic manufacturing value stream map. You can see you're measuring the days, you're measuring the cycle time, you're mapping the processes, you're measuring the output. And this is a way basically of just stringing together all the steps in a process that produce value. So each some steps produce value, some steps don't, as we see in a moment. And so what you want to do is, optimize capacity so that as much of it as possible is focused on doing that work that falls into a process step that produces value. And that's what value stream mapping is all about. So this is classic value stream mapping as applied to manufacturing. Let's bring that into a knowledge environment for just a moment, and let's think about probably a little bit more of the work, a little bit more of the type of environment that we're used to working in which we're delivering for a business need, or we're delivering for a tech feature or product feature or something like that. So the idea of value stream mapping begins and ends with the idea that it always starts with customer need or user need. Why does my customer want to do business with me? Why does my internal customer or my internal product user, what is it they need to use my system for? So it always starts with a need, and then the end of the value chain ends with value produced. Now, again, for me, ordinarily that's going to mean money. So you've got to map things all the way until you get to the money. There's a lot of different ideas of value, definitions of value out there, but you have to be rigorous and you have to have tenacity around mapping the value stream all the way from that initial need to where it produces the money and the positive ROI as well. Now, if you're in a government agency or a nonprofit or something like that, then that's not a problem. You just have to come up with the equivalent. What's the equivalent outcome? And then chances are there's some value streams in there that you still want to measure with money. So from feature to business need, this is kind of an old-fashioned way of looking at like an IT service development project or a software feature development project. But just for the moment, that's how we'll look at it. We'll look at it from feature business need. Now, usually you have some kind of feasibility. There's some business analysis, requirements gathering, what have you. From there, oftentimes there's a handoff to development. So this is where people are going to start building to the requirements that they got. And then, of course, you can have some kind of QA step in there, some kind of testing step. So before you release to the wild, whatever gets built gets tested. And then from testing, you typically have some kind of change management or release management step that's built in there. It's all about transitioning the product from the test environment, the dev environment, over to the production operational environment. And then finally, when that's ready, then you have delivery. Now, delivery is something we want to highlight here in just a moment. And then hopefully you have a feedback loop here so that you're seeing how does that thing behave once it's actually delivered. Are you collecting metrics about that that feed back into the way you design the other things that you're going to build? Now, that may or may not happen. Now, highlighting delivery is a special step in this process because delivery is where the value happens. Or at least even more accurate would probably be to say no value can happen until delivery. So if you think about all this stuff up front, identifying a need, running analysis, developing something, testing something, releasing something, all of that stuff is overhead. Now, overhead doesn't actually produce any value. That's not to say it's not important and doesn't have its place, but we don't want to get distracted by all this front-end stuff. And so when we talk about this idea of visualizing the value stream so that we can shrink the cycle time, that's why we want to do this, right? Because a lot of times this cycle can take a year or more. And where does delivery happen there? If we don't have any chance of realizing value until after delivery, then if all of this stuff in the front end took 10 months or took a year and a half, man, that's a long time not to be getting value. So if we can understand ways to shrink this cycle time, shrink it more and more, smaller cycle time, then we have an opportunity to produce value faster. And that's the kind of thing that we want to do. Now, if you look at mapping a value stream like I just showed you, let's just do a super simple value stream map of the process I just shared, right? Now, and what we see is immediately this looks really different than what we just looked at. Oh, and I should say, let's go back to this for just a minute. Now, it used to be that each one of these steps was actually a department. And then that's still true a lot of times, but when you get a lot of departmental handoffs, that's kind of a fundamentally anti-lean, anti-agile pattern of working. But a lot of organizations have done better with this, kind of dissolving the silos between these functional departments. But the thing I want to highlight here is even if the work is not organized to flow through a process like this, in terms of functional department to the next functional department, these functions, even if they're not a department, they still have to happen, right? They still have to happen in some capacity. You still need business analysis. There's still got to be development. There's still got to be testing. There's still got to be production and deployment and maintenance of the product in production. So you can think about it from that way as well, right? Like you don't have to think about it just in terms of departments, although you may. But one way or the other, you still want to map the value through these functions. So if we do that, we look at the simplistic value stream, all of a sudden, wow, we see a lot of red here. Why is it red? Red is because red is a day spent on this 40-day product or feature cycle that is not adding value. So if you look at the green ticks up here, really only these days spent on the green period of work, those are the only ones that were really contributing value to that end delivery point. And so you can see right away, most of the time that was spent in this feature development lifecycle was really fundamentally wasteful, because it was basically just sitting there waiting for the next thing to happen, right? Like maybe it was only spent 1 day in analysis or 2 days in development, maybe 1 day in testing, and then it's just waiting its turn to move on to the next step. So this is just a really simple idea of how you might map a value stream. You see right away where the issues with this. The big issue here is that the work in the system spent most of its time waiting on something else. Now that's an issue. Why? Because waiting is horrible. Waiting is wasteful. Waiting is one of the fundamental lean wastes. And so one of the first things we want to do when we're mapping a value stream is enable ourselves to visualize, where is work just sitting there waiting? And is there a way to get that work moving? Is there a way to streamline our process or our series of processes so that things just don't spend quite so much time waiting? And there's all kinds of things like this that you're able to spot once you map the value stream. So fundamental idea there, right? Now, why is waiting wasteful? Well, here's why. You can read a little bit more about this at IT Revolution if you want to. But you can mathematically prove that essentially there is a power law curve, an exponential curve associated with waiting. And the waiting is related to capacity. So this is one of the reasons it's a really bad idea to measure value based on utilization of your resources, because in fact, it's completely counterproductive. If you're trying to manage your team such that you're squeezing every last bit of person hour out of them, then what you're actually doing is you're compelling them to work at full capacity. And as you see in this graph, the closer to capacity that we get, all of a sudden, you're good to go up until about 85 or even 90%. Like if your teams are 90% full, then they're working at kind of optimal efficiency. But as soon as they pass that 90% line, then all of a sudden, task queues just blow up, and it takes forever to get anything done. And we've probably encountered this. And ask a question here too. Who's ever encountered an IT team that was only 90% busy? Who's ever encountered a testing team that was only 90% busy, or an IT ops team that's only 90% busy, right? It's laughable. You never encounter that unless you're in a really innovative organization. So there's too much work in process here, and there's too much work in process in our portfolios, right? And we all encounter this as part of the problem in the first place. Why do we want to map the value stream in the portfolio? Well, because we're working on so many things all at once. Bad news, right? And this is just this is with some relatively simple math, you can see why that's true. So if things have to wait, they have to queue up. And we all know the feeling of being queued up, especially a really long line. We don't like it. Why don't we like it? Because we know in our heart of hearts that it's wasteful. The other issue that we have here is that when we're at full capacity, then just overall flow is slow. You don't get a packet of work from point A to point B. You don't go from idea to delivery as fast as you otherwise might, even in the same system. The system's capacity is the same, but if you're cramming tons of work through, then everything just gets congested. And that's a source of slowness. And that's the opposite of what we're trying to cultivate. So full capacity equals slow flow. These are kind of fundamental principles that we want to keep in the back of our mind as we start to look at a little bit more of the specifics of applying these ideas to portfolio management. Now, lean agile techniques in kind of a modern context, techniques like Kanban, which is not original to software, or something like Agile or Scrum, which is. But still, fundamentally, these are just retreads of lean practices that are applied to specific types of work, specifically to software and technology teams or business teams. And these techniques actually have been quite effective. So that's pretty cool, right? Kanban is just a basic way of managing the flow of work. This is the simplest possible Kanban model that you could get here, right? Like you have a backlog over here that sits there waiting to be done. A team pulls work from the backlog. Again, doesn't have work pushed on them. You're letting them work at the capacity they have, but management's job is to keep that to-do list relentlessly prioritized so that when the team does have capacity, they can pull from the top of the stack and start working on the next most important thing. It's not the team's job to understand what the priority is. That's management's job. And then the team is always working on the most important thing. And then you can keep track of that. So this is all about sort of trying to establish this flow, establish this pull-based work. And then on the Scrum side, this is just a way of applying this so that you've got kind of a short cycle time for software teams or IT service teams. We're all familiar with Agile and Scrum and Kanban probably, so I won't belabor the point. But the main point is that these things work. They work well at a level of team scale. But there's some issues with that as well, right? So the first issue is that annoyingly, a lot of times at a team level or a Scrum level, then we start measuring value in things that are really useful for running work in an agile way at a team level, like story points or sizing or a burn down or whatever. Well, that's great. That's great for helping the team get their work done in a more efficient way. In a better prioritized way. But it stops short of actually translating the value of that output to terms that really, at the end of the day, the people who are making financial decisions about what type of work to invest in, what in our portfolio to prioritize, those types of agile metrics don't give those folks the information that they need to effectively manage the portfolio at portfolio scale. So team scale, this stuff is good, but it's not a solution at portfolio scale. And these are examples of the way that we might translate, or that CFOs or people who are approving our funding need to be able to convert the types of metrics that an agile team is using into something that will roll up to a higher level of portfolio management. You've got to figure out how to translate these things into dollars and cents values that your CFO can understand. So if you're not doing that, then you're not there with portfolio management. And so agile portfolio management, or even other techniques of lean product and portfolio management, there's all kinds of different acronyms and there's all kinds of different approaches for this. You'll hear LPM, you'll hear PPM, product and portfolio management. You'll hear this term FinOps, which I'll talk briefly about towards the end here. But these are all fundamentally ways of doing the same thing. They're ways of translating the output and the value that's being produced at the team level up through various hierarchies of management constructs, so that you are ultimately getting a business-wide, end-to-end understanding of how value is being produced across all of these tangled up initiatives. In the chat, Robert mentions measure the cost of delay. Oh my goodness. Robert, a shout out to you. I could not agree more. I've got a whole other talk actually that's just about the cost of delay. I don't have time to get into it too much here, but I will just say, if you only take one thing away from this talk, go check out cost of delay, and check out a fellow by the name of Don Reinertsen. Don Reinertsen is the product portfolio flow guru. Unfortunately, he doesn't really get the attention he deserves, I don't think. I think part of it is because some of his content, some of his techniques are, they get technical and they can be difficult to digest in just a day or two. Well, guess what, folks? What are our organizations trying to do? What is the point of a portfolio? Portfolio is there to manage and give you ROI on a large, complicated system of work. Our stakeholders need to understand that you're not necessarily going to develop the tools and skills to manage work at that level of complexity, at that level of scale, with something that you learn in 2 days. Sorry. So, I don't apologize for Don's meaty, dry book or his framework concepts, because we need some technocratic and some in some cases difficult concepts to be able to do this stuff. So anyway, Don Reinerson, he's got a great book. It's on my shelf up there. It's called The Principles of Product Development Flow, and it is a book that everybody should read. So anyway, getting value from agile team level metrics to portfolio level financial metrics, that's the name of the game. How can we use value stream management, identification, mapping to get to that? Because once we get beyond team level scale, or even beyond project level scale, this is kind of what we run into, right? Here we are in 2024. Our projects and our products and our work streams are very large scale, very complicated. And so the underlying technology work streams, the products that we develop to support the platform, the IT services, the software features and things, those things have to be mature and flexible and adaptive, and they have to be measurable and robust to be able to support that kind of work. And of course, we've got volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and I forget what the A stands for. Somebody can tell me, I'm sure, but the idea that we're dealing with a very rapid, very constantly changing, very complex environment in which basically it's impossible to get your head around the whole thing. And then if you do, by the time you've taken the time to really internalize the system, time's moved on and there's some new complex thing that you have to enter in. So you need a framework that can that allows you to adapt to that type of environment. And if you don't do that, then this is going to cost you money. It's going to cost reputational money, potentially penalties from compliance. You're going to miss opportunities. You're going to move slow. And worst of all, and probably most common of all, you're just not going to understand what's going on. You're going to be spending all this money on all these projects, all these products. But the people who are in charge of those dollars, they're going to have either a nagging uncertainty or just an outright sense of panic that they don't really understand. Are we spending on the right thing, and are we getting ROI on that thing? And getting answers to that, that's what portfolio value stream management is all about. So how do we do this? Well, we got to figure out, how do we measure these things? How do we measure them up through the layers from team level to portfolio level? How do we interlink our processes in a way that enables the measurement? How do we have a correct data governance environment so that we're just creating the data environment to be able to allow us to see what we need to see? Application data management is a recent trend that is enabling this. It's easier than ever to aggregate data across different products, different processes, different teams, and then using that data aggregation to create a unified data visualization environment with shared dashboards, that track the value and track the funding and track the work being done all the way through the system from portfolio level down through the team level. That's what this is about. So you're not going to do that without the right data environment, and you're not going to do that with the right tooling environment to support data aggregation and then to be able to measure it. Then, of course, even if you do have those tools and processes in place, it doesn't work without the right culture and business process. So culture, human factors is a big consideration, and so is process, as I mentioned. And so to do this, we've got different frameworks that have come along. Right now, one we probably have heard of is SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework. But SAFe, that I'm not necessarily. SAFe is not the end all be all. I'm not a cheerleader for SAFe, although I'm not throwing it completely out the window either. There are some very useful things contained within the SAFe framework. The SAFe framework itself, I wouldn't say is the essential solution, but we can look at SAFe for some useful concepts. So one of the things that SAFe introduced a while ago was this idea that there's different types of value streams, and you've got to be able to understand what type of value stream you're working with. So like the value stream that I showed a moment ago, this would be what SAFe considers a development value stream. This is something where you're defining a need and then you're taking it out through to release of a product or a feature. But then SAFe also defines what they call an operational value stream, which is kind of like a higher level value stream that sits on top of the little development value streams. And the output of this is not necessarily the product or the feature. The output of this is some kind of business outcome. So you're starting to push up towards a level that's a little bit higher than just the output of a team. So operational value stream is one way to measure that, certainly not the only one. Now we can't move on without showing the full configuration of SAFe, because the top level configuration is you'll see it's the portfolio level here. And this, this is kind of it's a lot of pretty icons, but the idea here is that you're using the very same lean agile principles that I introduced in the beginning. You're introducing those at various levels of scale, and this can be done, right? So, and I think one thing that I've noticed about agile practices is that there are certain tools, shorter cycle times, iterative feedback, iterative product development. Prioritizing the product with product ownership and things like that, using Kanban and tools like that to really start visualizing and mapping the flow of work through the system. Frameworks like SAFe, they try to use those same tools across the different levels, right? So if we look at the team level here, down here, we can see there's a little Scrum icon. They've got Scrum, they've got Kanban. Those are the tools that they espouse for team level flow. But then if you move up to the program level, once again, now we have a program level Kanban, right? So we're using the same basic idea of divvying work up into buckets of, to do, doing right now, and then done. They're using that same kind of idea. And then if we pop up to the solution level, now we got solution Kanban. And then we pop up to the portfolio level, now we have portfolio level Kanban. So nothing new in terms of the lean idea, the lean tool, but we're using it to measure different kinds of flows. And then here at the portfolio level, you can see they've got the portfolio value stream. That's a different type of value stream than the example value stream I provided, which would have lived down here, right? But you have this kind of recursive set of agile lean techniques that frameworks like SAFe at least attempt to apply at different levels of scale. I'm not saying they can't be applied. I'm just saying that you don't need SAFe to use those techniques. Now, why is it so important to manage the portfolio level? Because ultimately, the portfolio is the key to both agility at the enterprise level, expanding capacity in ways that don't compete with each other, so they're all aligned. Most importantly, is probably managing the priorities, so we understand, hey, what's going to give us the ROI? We need to manage our priorities across the portfolio to that. It helps us optimize our quality, optimize our flow, spot and reduce waste, as I already talked about. And then finally, translating this idea of value. Okay, if we're mapping the value stream from need to value delivered, mapping that to monetary terms, or again, if that's, if the profit motive is not your main mission, then what's the equivalent, right? There's always going to be some equivalent way to measure value that may not be profit, but usually it is. So if we look back at the SAFe full configuration, once again, you can see here, these are the same lean techniques that date all the way back to Deming, 80-year-old techniques that now here we have this in the 2023 6.0 version of SAFe, right? So it's the same ideas that are still trying to be applied, just at portfolio level. So stepping back away from SAFe or Agile or any kind of framework, there are frameworks that you can implement at portfolio level to do this, even without subscribing to a branded framework or something like that. Now, one of the ones that I like to talk about the most is the LPM framework. Because this is specifically applied to the portfolio level, it's specifically applied to using lean techniques to manage at portfolio scale. And it provides us with some tools and some mechanisms we can use to start doing the thing that we're talking about doing at the appropriate level of scale that we need to do it. So what is LPM? Essentially, LPM is a structure for prioritizing the highest value work, the most important work. It applies the same lean techniques like Kanban and throttling the flow so that we get the most flow through our capacity, prioritizing, understanding where the value comes from, and then kind of deprioritizing or ignoring or eliminating altogether the long tail of projects and product work that is not this thing that's the most important. And then, very importantly, this is all built around the capacity of the team. So you're trying to cultivate the flow through the team, because ultimately the team is where the work delivery is coming from. So optimize the team capacity. You're going to optimize the capacity of the whole entire system. Mario asked, which approach is more effective than safe? I think an approach that you put your thinking cap on and figure out what's the framework you need. Safe always says it's adaptable, it's a toolbox, but there's no one perfect answer for that, right? There's not a framework out of the box that's going to solve all your portfolio management problems. So having a framework that embraces learning and embraces testing and experimentation across all levels of the portfolio, SAFE does espouse that, but that's really the thing that I would take from a framework like that, is a process for discovery and things like that. But LPM, I would also say, if you do want a named framework, LPM is not exactly a branded framework, but it's a portfolio management framework that I would suggest can be very effective. So we got 9 principles behind LPM. These are kind of abstract and broad, but I'll explain kind of how does the rubber meet the road on actually using these principles to implement a portfolio management framework. Shift to customer centricity, transparency, adaptive strategy, alignment, delivering business value frequently. So again, we see that theme of the shorter, faster cycle time, structure and value streams. Okay, like that's the point of this whole talk. Outcomes over outputs is a very key principle. Optimizing flow, reducing waste. We've talked about that. Shortening the cycles. We've talked about that. And then doing other lean things like leveling the capacity, so that you don't have these big surges in demand, big drops in demand. If you can level things like that, leveling demand with your capacity, matching capacity to the demand of the portfolio, those things build efficiency into your system. So the graphical representation you usually see for LPM is this kind of like pyramid of 3 triangles. And so these triangles, they basically divide the domains of lean portfolio management into 3 zones. And the first zone is strategic funding. So as we see, I like LPM because LPM starts with a dollars and cents economic framework, because you've got to have an economic framework in place to make decisions, and you got to be able to measure value in an economic language. So the first zone of LPM is this idea that you're going to manage all the portfolio funding strategically, and that's going to essentially tie to investment in dollars. So I won't read every bullet at you for time's sake, but these are kind of the priorities of these 3 different zones. So strategic funding is the first one. They own the flow. They are responsible for funding, and importantly, they're also responsible for communicating, maintaining the vision, so that you can achieve that alignment. There's no alignment without a shared vision. And then the next zone here is portfolio operations. So this is where the PMO might live. This is where the logistics and the actual project management, the actual product management, however you're organizing your work streams, this is where the work actually gets managed and executed on. And then finally, because this is a large portfolio scale effort, there's got to be a governance aspect, because without governance, this will not last long enough and it will fall apart. Incentives will drift. You've got to have a policy framework in place. Also, I think just to secure commitment to a framework like this, because there's a lot of teams and orgs out there who talk about things like LPM, who talk about things like SAFE. But if you look at it, if you think about really the true value stream from business need out to value as measured in dollars, the only way that that's really being measured is with the annual budgeting cycle. If we were in a room right now, I would ask everybody, raise your hand if your budgets are handled on an annual cycle. It would probably be most of us, right? So to me, that's a big red flag, because it doesn't matter how much you decompose your cycle time. underneath the annual budgeting cycle. But if the master cycle is still the annual budget, then sorry, but we really haven't actually reduced our most important cycle time in any meaningful way. And things like agile budgeting and participatory budgeting and FinOps, they're offering some very meaningful, very valuable solutions to that. But getting shorter than an annual budget is something that I think it's safe to say most of the world is not hit to that yet. That's not happening now. Some organizations are embracing techniques to do that, but those are the organizations that are leaning into, I think, real 21st century work patterns, because we've got to shrink those cycle times. We got to get faster than just a year. So, this framework is intended to enable these types of outcomes, right? Instead of getting away from a sort of a brittle top-down waterfall management of work, we're building in learning, building in flexibility to adapt. We're delivering value as frequently as possible in as fast of a cycle as we possibly can. The transparency and the shared data mean that feedback can get built into everything. This starts to establish a common understanding, and that common understanding is really important, of the idea of value, how value is measured, how value is produced, and what the strategic vision is. And then again, outcomes over outputs. Value streams, not projects, and then a classic agile idea that cross-functional teams are responsible all the way through delivery. Now, that's not just in a development team, that's a business team, a portfolio management team, and things like that. A few other thoughts here. Just around the way that we measure this financially, economically. Funding has to be tied to the value-based outcome, not plan-driven approvals of big buckets of money. Now, take a second to say that again. Plan-driven approvals of big buckets of money. And I'll just leave that at that. Like, that may sound familiar to some of us. OKRs, understanding the customer, understanding business value, understanding the definition of value. Could your team, in a 60-second elevator pitch, could they translate their organization's definition of value into monetary terms and how that relates to the work they're doing? If not, that's probably something to work on. I talked about vision, talked about alignment, talked about value definition, right? So an LPM framework, this is a real fast flyover. You can take 3 or 5 day workshops just on LPM to really learn how to implement it. But these are some of the basic concepts. And LPM, at the end of the day, as the LPM framework matures, that should allow teams optimized for capacity to pull from that prioritized backlog that I mentioned. So, somebody at the portfolio level is keeping the list of work, the backlog, the to-do list. They're keeping that relentlessly prioritized so that the team, they never have to worry about anything except doing as much work as they can with their bandwidth that they've established through, a persistent team dynamic, not a revolving door of different team members, because you're never really going to get to a high capacity like that. So having a good culture with a persistent team, optimizing that team's capacity, and then them understanding, as soon as they get done with a piece of work, all they've got to do is pull from the top of the stack and keep on rolling. That's the type of work pattern that LPM is intended to enable. Okay, so I'm getting towards the end here. We're about to conclude, but I just want to throw out a few final concepts, kind of for further reading, for you to be aware of. I mentioned this newer trend called FinOps. Again, it's not the only term. You'll see different terms for it, but if you're not familiar with this, you should check it out. Because there's a realization in the marketplace that we're not doing well enough from a portfolio management standpoint to get us all the way to satisfactory financial tracking and financial assurance of how things are working through our portfolio. So FinOps is interesting because it's a movement that has really grown out of the CFO's office, as CFOs and financial stakeholders start to understand that we need ways of measuring, we need ways of tracking and managing work in financial terms through these portfolios, and that's what FinOps is all about. So if you're not familiar with this, check it out. And then this is one of my last slides here. There are ways to do this. All we have to do is align the portfolio level value streams and then understand where's budget coming from, where's money coming from. We can align those things and then we can measure those things. Doesn't have to be a big Death Star centralized budget. Budgets, funding comes from all kinds of places, right? Like we may have funding associated with a very specific product value stream. We may have a budget associated with a product line. We may have a budget associated with an epic. We might even have a budget associated just to a specific team. And though those budgets get spent in different ways, but it's important to track how those budgets get spent to the value measurement. And hopefully that makes sense. So if you're interested, you can check out LPM, check out FinOps. It really gets into the weeds on how this gets implemented. We do this, again, by aggregating data. FinOps is kind of cool because there's some neat new tooling platforms that allow us to aggregate data from all across our organizational ecosystems, and we can translate that aggregated data into these types of portfolio level metrics. And that's really quite new. So if you're not familiar with tools like Aptio, which was recently purchased by IBM, if you're not familiar with FinOps, check those things out. It's just in the last couple of years here, and those tooling and data tools and those data visualization environments are all oriented around doing this kind of thing. We do this effectively. Finally, we've got shared KPIs, shared metrics, and those metrics and KPIs can reside on top of these shared data ecosystems, but then they're translated into LPM terms so that we're measuring the things that allows the portfolio management framework to mature and progress. All right, so main things, and then I'll wrap. Engage with finance early. Portfolio management does not work without translating the value in financial terms. Figure out the tooling. So I mentioned that. FinOps tool platforms, tools like Aptio, things like that. This takes time. So, it's not going to happen overnight. Overnight transformations are not possible. And then check out some of these other framework concepts if you're not familiar with them. So boom, I've got 159. And remember, for commercial business especially, value must be measured with money. So don't stop mapping that value stream until you can translate it to monetary terms. All right. And with that, I'll kick it back to David. I think I've crammed as much content into this presentation as I can. I really appreciate everybody attending. You'll get a copy of the slides. You can find me on LinkedIn if you have any questions about this stuff. All right.